Welcome, Red Eyes members. Thank you very much for joining us. It's good to have you with us. We are talking with Terry Boardman. We're talking about Steiner. We're talking about the New World Order. We're talking about the church, the importance or differences, I guess, as well, between the East and the West, what has happened in history, where we are going. And in this second hour here, I definitely want to get into continuing the narrative, as it were, that Terry has been on here and talking about this from a historical perspective as we kind of move forward in time and see where we are at now, and potentially even then what we could see happen in the next period, or how this will resolve itself. And Terry, you were talking just about this very interesting thing about the life of a child when we kind of broke off there. Tell us a little bit more about that, and recap that for us briefly. What we talked about, that you've divided up the life of a child in sets of 33s. Is that correct? And the development in a child's life.
No, the 33 is the 3 times 33 and a third makes a century.
Yes.
So the key thought here is that one can compare 1 century in the life of humanity as a whole, to 1 year in the life of a child.
Ah, got you. All right.
Yeah?
Yes.
So the life of the child goes through various stages. And the interesting thing is, of course, because all of us go through these stages, whether we're Eskimo, Chinese, African, European, whatever. All children, for example, go through the 3 stages of learning in the first 3 years. Interestingly enough, these 3 archetypal gestures of walking, speaking, and thinking. Those 3 things. We've all learned to do that. Yeah, we all did that. And then we all, around about the 7th year of our lives, sometimes a little earlier, some people, but we all changed our teeth. We all dropped our milk teeth, and we all grew our own teeth. That's the marker for the next phase, yeah? Around about the 7th year of life. And then the other thing we all did, traditionally, Hendrik, this was usually placed around about in the 14th year. And again, these days, because of modern civilization, it's getting younger and younger. But you will not find any children who experience puberty before the 9th or the 10th year.
That's right.
Yeah, and you don't usually find any kids who experience it as late as, say, the 18th or the 19th year. It's usually between the 12th and the 14th year, and traditionally it was seen as the 14th year. So these are 7-year phases. Do you see? The change of the teeth at 7, puberty at 14, and then comes the more subtle one. Change of teeth is very gross, very physical. Puberty is still physical, but less gross, less hard, so to speak, and more internal, the changes of the emotions and all of that, which happens with the teenager. But when you come to 21, around 20 or 21, then, I don't know about in Sweden, but I think in many countries in Europe, certainly here in England, that was the time where traditionally you were given the key of the house.
Right.
Right?
Right.
You're given the key of the house, which means that you are now a responsible person. You're now a responsible social adult. You're in charge of your own destiny. You can come and go as you please. And of course, in terms of the law, you're recognized in law as a householder, voting, marriage, all the rest of it. Yeah.
Right.
In Japan, it's 20, but that's still that's still the 20th year, so to speak. Sorry, the 21st year. Yeah. So the age of 21st year. But you see what I mean? It's the same time. It's approximately these same markers: 7, 14, 21. So we have a 7-foldness there.
Right. And then even next up from that, we have about 29. That's even in astrological terminology, the Saturn return and all of this.
Yeah. Well, 28 and 29 is slightly different, actually. That's a different thing. As you say, 29 is the Saturn return. That's one thing. But the 7-foldness is something slightly different. Yeah.
All right.
So this 7-foldness you will find in ancient esoteric teachings everywhere, the notion that 7 is related to time. But the interesting thing here that Steiner brings forward is this other rhythm, this new rhythm, if you will, since the time of Christ, which has been inscribed into humanity. And again, this is even, and the reason why I'm convinced of this is that because I've looked at other cultures, the histories of other cultures where one can see these phenomena borne out, which were ostensibly not Christian cultures, do you see? Obviously, the one I know best is Japan, but one can look at China, one can look at India, and you can see similar gestures. Now, what I mean by that is you look at the 7th century, look at the 9th century, because that's an interesting time, what happens in the child at the age of 9, in the 9th year. Right? The very subtle changes go on in the 9th year. And it's interesting, for example, the death process begins in the 9th year, because the death begins at the age of 9 when your brain cells begin to die. So, the human being obviously is born and advances towards death, but there are these two poles, the death process and the birth process. They advance towards each other, so to speak. And the death pole begins in the human being already then in the 9th year, and the first part that begins to die is the brain, interestingly enough.
Didn't know that. That's interesting.
And then, of course, that death process then builds and builds and builds through life until, obviously, finally we do die. But it's the 9th century, right? So if you look at what happens in human in the 9th century in different parts of the world, is very interesting. I haven't got time to go into all of that, so just recommend it to your listeners. Yeah.
Do you have more information about that on your website or in one of your books?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, on my website. Yeah.
Brilliant.
And if you bear in mind what I said earlier about the Council of 869, this is also in the 9th century.
That's right.
This is where in Europe the human being was, as it were, Steiner uses the radical expression, the abolition of the spirit. That's perhaps a bit too radical, but you see what he's saying, that the church said the individual does not have a spirit anymore. You're cut off from the life of the spirit. So this is really pushing the human being down into earthly dimension. And many children around that age begin to feel that they're separate from their parents. That's where you start to have rather subtle feelings of the child, of insecurity, that maybe my parents are not my parents.
Right.
This kind of thing, yeah. And another thing that happens at that time is it's around that time when your breathing is trying to come into order as a child. Yeah. In between from birth to 7, your breathing is not in order, but from 7 to 14, this is the time when your breathing is trying to come into order. It's a time of harmony and disharmony within the soul life and in the physiology. And it's a complex issue, but the point is that's an important time, 9th. And then 14 and finally 21, you see. And Steiner points out that what happens at the change at 7, Henrik, is that we, as it were, that the change of the teeth is a marker that we have grown our own life body, so to speak. We have our physical body from our mothers when we're born, and we've grown our own life body. That body which just supports our life. That's our plant body, if you will.
Right.
And then by 14, forgive me, I'm having to, really do this pretty shorthand, but we could go into much more detail. And at 14, that's when we have grown our, as it were, our what's called in the esoteric sciences, our astral body, our body of feeling.
Right.
Yeah? That's our animal body, which we share with the animals. Yeah. And then we see that from 14 to 21, the teenager then really starts to think for himself or herself. Do you see there's an analogy between these 3 stages with the walking, the speaking, and the thinking, which happens between 0 and 3.
Very interesting.
It's all an archetype of threefoldness, yeah?
So what would you say is the principle that kind of describes this? In one sense, I get this idea of, as above, so below. That concept that the macrocosm is a reflection down to in the microcosm. So our life has the same process as the life above us, so to speak. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So the third phase then is completed at 21. And at 21, then the human ego, the human self, the self-autonomous individual. It's like as if, Henrik, you had a house built, you bought a house, and then you move into the house, and now it's your house. You haven't made it a home yet. It's not yet a home, but you've got the key, and now there you are in this new house at 21. This house you've been building for the past 21 years. Or has rather been built with you and by you and for you. Now you are the master of it.
And now it's time to furnish the house, as it were.
Exactly. To make it a home, do you see?
Yes.
And this is the significance of the 21 and the 21st century. And I don't have to tell you, I mean, you've got so much on the Red Eye site. It's incredible that from all kinds of perspectives, many people today are aware of the specialness of this time.
Yes.
of the specialness of this period of time we're living in, yeah? That they're aware above all that this is a global consciousness, a global society, a global situation we're in now. And that's why it is truly existential. Because the problems that we face are problems that affect the whole of humanity and the very physical nature of the planet itself, you see? So this is why the ego, the 21st century in that sense, is really the century of the ego of man, or the ego of the human being. Yeah? The human being has come into his, her, its egohood in this 21st century. And that is something which is so to speak, inscribed in history, I would say.
And that's nothing, nothing bad. There's nothing wrong with that, because as anything, as you described before, there's certain sets of progress that we need to go through, or different periods that we need to go through in order to become ourselves, basically, and fully manageable, or fully. Come into our own being, as it were, because what you're describing with the ego, many would say, yes, definitely we're in a more egotistic society, and that's a bad thing. But on the other hand, I think that a lot of that's a necessary process for our learning to go through, right?
Absolutely, Henrik. I'm not using ego in a negative sense at all.
Sure.
I'm saying, it's absolutely necessary in this age of freedom that the human being must be able to stand on our own spiritual feet. And that brings me very much to the question of the New World Order, you see, because the question there is, that one can see right from the beginning. I mean, as I said before, about churchianity, Christ did not found any church.
That's right.
He basically said to the disciples, "You're my brothers," yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's no sense in which you have a hierarchy and a church. He was not about founding that. These are things from the pre-Christian ancient world. With the Christian, I would say that with the Christian impulse, you get the greatest impulse to brotherhood. It wasn't the first. Buddha had already created in his communities, his sangha, his this sense of a cosmopolitan community. But because that was in Asia, there was still very, very strongly this feeling of the great being is infinitely far above me. There was no sense in which Buddha said to his disciples, "You're my brothers and sisters." The sense of worshipping the elder, for example, is so powerful in Asia that was, it's still the case today in the Buddhist and Hindu world. You see what I mean?
Yes.
In regard to the master, the guru, the teacher, and so on. But in the West, or in the I prefer not to say the West anymore. I prefer to say this new impulse which comes for humanity as a whole. This is truly an impulse of brotherhood, nothing to do with hierarchy. So, when we see the hierarchy that the Church attempted to perpetuate after the 12th and 13th centuries, what is that hierarchy? It is a hierarchy in which the Church was carrying on certain habits which were, in essence, pre-Christian, you see.
Yes.
These go back for thousands of years, yeah. And I know there are all sorts of theories about where these come from, but I'd just like to bring in something from the anthroposophical perspective, which is not discussed by various alternative thinkers in this sense.
Right.
And that is that Rudolf Steiner felt that the thing that he really had to bring forward very much in the modern world, and this has to do again a bit with this relationship between Christianity and Buddhism, because Buddhism still reckons with reincarnation, do you see? Yeah? And that is the idea of karma and reincarnation. That the time has been coming since 1800, very slowly at first, but since the 1960s, faster and faster, that the Western world is now beginning to become familiar again with the concept of reincarnation, the concept of previous lives. And that means, who then are these guys in the New World Order?
Yeah.
But when we look at the phenomenon of the New World, Steiner's idea was, Henrik, that history is actually